Good morning and welcome to another episode of the Tired F1 Pod. We're back and better than ever. And Amar, despite having a baby, you're regularly back on the show. How you doing?
I am tired, but I'm super committed. As you can see, I put everything else aside in my life, a choice that I would recommend no one else make, but I have done that, and we're here because we can't stay without talking about Formula One.
That's right. Amar's baby is now fending for himself, and he's here with us. And making his YouTube debut. I am so happy to see the F1 diplomat, Diplo. How are you?
I'm good. I'm also tired, but I think it's just part of the name of the podcast, right? So happy to be here.
Everyone's tired. And if you don't know who Diplo is, first of all, what are you doing? Go find him. Link in the description below to his Twitter slash X. And again, if you're ever on a space and it's F1 related and Diplo's not on it, just leave. Just leave. There's no point. There's no point. He needs to be on it. We're going to talk about some F1 stuff. The week has continued to be a little bit slow, but things seem to have picked up a little bit as we're starting just gently to hear some rumors about where the second Spanish driver, Carlos Sainz, might end up after we had some big news about Fernando Alonso moving to Aston Martin. Or not moving, staying at Aston Martin, but it feels like a move given how volatile things have been. What do you guys make of Fernando's choices?
Yeah, well, I mean, you said it right when you said Fernando maybe moving to Aston Martin. It did feel like it. It felt like he was making a concerted effort to insert himself in the Red Bull seat and the Mercedes seat. He may have even talked to Audi. Who knows? I mean, I'm sure he's maybe even he hit up Haas. I don't know. It could have happened, but I thought in the end it's probably the right decision for him, no? Because Aston Martin looked to be a team on the up. Honda and Aston in the past, Honda and Alonso in the past have not worked out, but the Honda of New is a lot better than the Honda of the McLaren days. So it certainly seems like he made the best calculated move that he could, and staying through the end of the 26 season, I think is a win-win on both sides. And he can kind of play it out and see what his future looks like. So I think in the end, a bit of a non-surprise, right? And my question is mostly on the other Aston seat, if there is going to be movement there or not. But this one
Hmm.
seems like a pretty straightforward thing. What do you
Yeah.
think, F1 Diplo?
Yeah, this doesn't surprise me in the slightest. I think given his age and where he's at the point of his career, it wouldn't make sense to go and try to start something new or try to hope to bring another team back to life. They haven't had the same start that they had last year, the team with the performance and the podiums and all that. But at the end of the day, momentum is still strong, and he has a better baseline here than I think pretty much anywhere else that he could go to, barring the top teams. But that comes with their own problems, like you said. So if you go to Red Bull, you have to deal with Max. And he said, right, I think he said he would go to Red Bull if there was no Max. And of
We,
course,
we,
Red
we
Bull are not
assume.
gonna. Yes, yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
of course.
Fernando says a lot of things, right? So there we go. But yeah, I don't blame. I can't get mad at this choice. It makes the most sense for him.
Yeah, like I'm not mad at him about it, and I get it, and I get what both of you guys are saying. Like if I was Fernando, it's probably the right choice. But as an F1 fan, there's a little part of me that's a little disappointed. I'm not gonna lie. Maybe the Mercedes move was, I mean, that was probably just going to be a sideways move anyway, if not a slightly backwards move, given Aston's trajectory. So I guess I'm not too fussed about that. But Max versus Fernando at Red Bull, tell me that you guys weren't at least slightly enticed by that. That would have been fireworks.
Would it have been though? I mean, would it have been? I mean, is that something that Red Bull will allow? I mean, I don't know. That is a highly
I don't care
combustible
about
pair that
them.
they don't want to do.
I don't care about Red Bull. I don't own Red Bull. I'm not in charge of
If
keeping
that's the case, I
harmony in
would have
the.
loved. Yeah, but I'd love to then see Lewis and Fernando at
Oh
Ferrari. Look
yeah,
at that.
yeah,
What would
yeah. Me,
that
I
be then?
would.
What
I
would
would
be
love
so?
that.
Of course you would love that. Are you sure you'd love that?
Yeah, it would be
Your guy lost
hilarious
out the last
fun.
time.
Did
Okay.
he?
Yeah, I mean, I see where you're at with that, but I don't believe that would have ever happened. I think Fernando wanted that to happen, I think in some world, but I think what they have with Checo, which we'll probably talk about later, is probably a better deal for them.
I mean, I think Diplo was right that there was a little bit of Fernando reluctance to go up against Max, and I say that in the same way that we talked about Lando,
Mm.
that it's not fear. It's just you know that the chips are stacked against you. So why would you put yourself in a position where actually, if your aim is just to win your third title, where are you going to do that? Are you going to do it at Red Bull against Max Verstappen, or are you going to do it at Aston on an upward trajectory? Don't know.
To be fair, he's probably not going to do it at either. But I
Oh,
mean, but yes, you're right. It's easier. It's easier. It's easier to win a title as a number one. But yeah, I don't think he's. Look, Fernando strikes me as the guy where like he does have that chip on his shoulder that he
Yeah.
feels like he should have more titles. And he drives with that passion, especially
Yeah.
for his age. But I also like he's just out there like trying to drive an F1 car probably as long as he possibly can. And that's what I get from it. And so, if he can just like Aston's giving him everything. They're like, here's all the money. You run development. You are in leadership of the team. Like he has everything there. And I'm not saying that he'd be afraid of the competition. I think he would challenge it head on. But that comes with like more stresses, more dramas. And Fernando's probably like, hey, I show up, I drive, have a little bit of fun with it. And if I so happen to start winning, then so be it. I mean, he has the ability and the experience and the skill set to win, but so much of F1 is not it's not just that, right? You don't just need that to
Yeah, I mean, I take your
so
point. I do take your point, but I definitely think that Fernando has an end game. He always has an end game, and
he'd love to win, don't get me wrong.
yeah,
I mean, like
but
he's
not,
like that evil villain, but he's having fun while he's the evil villain.
but not just love. I think he wouldn't have come back. I don't think he would have come back to Alpine or Aston if there wasn't, in his head at least, the possibility of him winning a third title. But just moving on very briefly to Carlos Sainz, because I think that will hopefully segue into what we're going to talk about for the bulk of this. Sainz to Mercedes. We've been talking about different options for him. What do you guys think of that one?
I mean, ultimately, this feels like the best option for him, right? I'm going to make the assumption here for a second that Lance Stroll will continue in that seat, although should he? I don't know, probably not. But if that's not the seat that's available, the Red Bull seat doesn't look like it will be available, right? It does look like Checo's doing enough to at least get himself another year. And do Red Bull really want to bring Sainz in? Probably if they do decide to move on from Checo, but that's something we'd have to wait the whole season to see, right? Because he had a really good start, so he would arguably have to have a series of races where he is just nowhere in the vicinity, right, to kind of justify that move. So if the Red Bull seat is gone, the Aston seat is not available. Yeah, the Mercedes seat is probably the only one. You don't really want to go to stake right now, right? Do we really want to see Carlos pulling up in the stake car next year, waiting a half a minute to get a pit stop done? I don't think that seems like a great, and it does also seem like that option would be available to him a couple years down the line. So it's not like it's gone. So yeah, why not? If a couple years at Mercedes is probably the best he can do, or step away. So yeah.
And Diplo, let's say that's a done deal. How do the dynamics suddenly alter themselves at Mercedes? Is George automatically number one and Sainz go
well,
sit in your corner, or
no, I don't think it's ever like that, but I think that Sainz would be going into a team, and Sainz has been that guy for a lot of teams in the past few seasons, right? He's been at Renault and then McLaren and then Ferrari, and Red Bull, right, or Toro Rosso where he started, right? So he's been around and he's been sort of what we would call a floater, but he's been making the most of it, and he's sort of had the experience of being at other teams and all that. George is the academy driver graduate that sort of fell into the team. And so there would be a dynamic there, but I don't think it would be anything, fireworksy. I think that they would obviously push each other. They both race pretty passionately and very hard. But I don't think that they would just immediately become like, public enemy number ones to each other. I don't think that's the case. And as far as, I've seen some chatter on Twitter. Look, a seat is better than no seat. People are like, well, Carlos shouldn't go to Mercedes because they want Kimi Antonelli, and he should go to Sauber because Audi. And so if I'm Carlos, obviously like there's the connection that he has with Audi. But one thing is for sure, as of right now, Audi isn't in the sport yet. And we don't know how they're going to enter, how they're going to become custodians of this team that they're taking over. What are they going to improve? And it's surely not going to happen overnight, because if you guys have professional experience anywhere you go, organizational change doesn't happen overnight. And that's sort of what plagued Ferrari at first, because they just kept firing people when things weren't going their way. And now, we see a little bit of that, like, hey, just let him do his thing, and it's kind of working out. And so Carlos would be smart. Okay, it's Audi, it's a good name, they have the ties, but it would still be a risky thing to jump in head first and say, okay, well, give me a 6-year deal with you guys, right? So we don't know we don't know where they're gonna go and how they're
Yeah,
gonna enter the sport. So
yeah.
for me, it's a 1+1 makes sense, give him the option.
Mm.
It's not a stopgap. Contracts don't even mean anything in F1 anymore. I feel like it would happen with McLaren and Ricardo. So the length of the contract doesn't really matter. I'm sure he would argue for a longer contract that can be cut shorter versus a shorter one that can be extended. Nobody wants to keep figuring out what they want to do every year. But yeah, it would be a good fit. The team, they support both drivers. I mean, we see
Yeah.
that even though the fan bases might get like nippy at one another, Mercedes is a great holistic place where the drivers might not necessarily always feel that pressure or burden of performance, and they can kind of be themselves. And so it might be a good stop for him along the
Yeah.
way. And if he's good enough, they might extend him. And it gives Mercedes some time to evaluate Kimi without
Yeah.
putting the pressure on
Yeah.
him to perform in what I say Kimi, I don't mean right, Kimi Antonelli, and people are like, there can only be one until he wins.
Amar's
But
one of those guys.
yeah, okay, fine. So Antonelli, and so I think that it gives them some time to not sort of, oh, come on, kid, perform so we can put you in that Mercedes seat, and it will remove some pressure off of him and let him develop into the driver that he needs to become, and also gives them time to evaluate. So I think it's a win-win-win if it happens, if the rumors are true. I can't see it being a bad move, and
Yeah.
it'll be easier for me to log on to Twitter every day too. So after a race, especially.
So yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you guys have said. I feel like Carlos is always the guy that's last in the game of musical chairs, and never really through any fault of his own. Like, let's be honest, if Lewis hadn't become available, Carlos would still have the seat at Ferrari. There'd be no doubt about that. He's just perfect there. And the fact that even now, the fact that he's being talked more positively about in terms of a Mercedes seat is only because Fernando's dropped out of the running and Mercedes aren't really 100% sure that Kimi Antonelli is going to be the guy that should be in that seat in 2025. It's never a positive. We want Carlos Sainz. And I have to say, I don't really understand that because everything that he's done in his career so far has been back against the wall. I have to prove myself. And he has done every single time. The only time he hasn't, I think, was maybe against Hulkenberg at Renault for one season. And I don't know if that is what colors everyone's perception of him, that maybe he's not that good because of that one season. But there's never really been anything when he was at McLaren. He compared really well against Lando. Ferrari, where he was expected to just fall down flat, he's been not regularly beating Leclerc, but he's been there or thereabouts. And you kind of feel that if Charles isn't there to do the job on a particular day, Sainz is definitely there, and often can outperform Leclerc. So it's not. So I just don't understand why everyone's so reluctant to take him on. And I think that's going to segue a little bit into what I want to talk about next, which is can we talk up a particular driver at a team without derogating the second one? And I want to talk about Ferrari and Mercedes in this topic, right? Because for the last 6 months or so, and longer at Mercedes for the last 2 or 3 years, there's always been this kind of feeling that if you talk about Leclerc being good, like having a good weekend, it's suddenly a black mark against Carlos Sainz, and much more in the other direction. That if Sainz has a good weekend, Australia I think was a good example. It suddenly becomes, this is it. Sainz is the better driver. He has been the whole time, and Charles Leclerc is nothing. And it's happened the same at Mercedes, that you've got these two drivers who are absolutely brilliant. And if Lewis has a run of form where he's not the faster driver on a Saturday or getting the results on a Sunday, suddenly he's washed. Or that Russell was never really anything anyway, and therefore, him being beaten by Lewis is just a reflection of that. I think the argument is much more nuanced, but I want to draw you guys into it a little bit because I see so much of this on social media. This absolute one is better than the other. There's no middle ground.
Yeah, so let me see if I can take a stab at this from the Ferrari perspective, because I do think the Lewis Hamilton criticism thereabouts is slightly different, in part because he set a benchmark, right? So when you have set a certain standard, which has been the standard that's been way, way above what we would judge a normal driver by, or normal Formula One driver by, I think that changes things. But I think the Ferrari one is interesting, right? Because you and I have argued in the past, and I have taken the position that, maybe Ferrari is making this mistake in sort of moving to Lewis Hamilton, not because he is, and it has nothing to do with him, right? I would just say that where Ferrari are at as a team is also the result of what Carlos has been giving them in terms of his contributions from the driver side of the development. And we saw examples of these over the last couple of years. Even if he was getting beat out by Charles, you could always see what Carlos was thinking, his mind, his way of controlling strategy from within the cockpit. I mean, the Singapore race is such a great example of great craftsmanship and driving slowly, right? Which is not something Formula One drivers are accustomed to doing. So I actually kind of really look at that win as, maybe 2 or 3 wins, on typical race weekends, right? So I think there's a little bit of that happening. I think what we've also seen in this season thus far is that Carlos is a step above Charles. I mean, it's not. We've seen Charles struggle in qualifying in Japan, but even Australia wasn't great by his standards, and he's a race winner there, by the way. If Carlos had not had to sit out Saudi because of an appendix, one that he couldn't do anything about, I mean, who knows what that result could have been? And we can argue he would have easily been on the podium with the Red Bull drivers there. So I think there's a little bit of that's going into it. And because Ferrari has announced this change so early in the season, I think this is giving us a chance to sort of make that comparison race in and out. So I think it's just a factor of quick reaction. But I don't look into it a whole lot to say, hey, Leclerc's actually not that great, because we have seen his greatness play out in the 22 season, if only to be done in by Ferrari themselves. So yeah, that's my take on the Ferrari stuff. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Diplo, what do you reckon?
Yeah, look, there's no denying that Charles came into F1 with a lot of hype and potential, and I think he's one of the quickest guys around a lap, in modern F1. But he's also had a lot of unforced errors. Yeah, the team have let him down. He's had strategy missed calls and then reliability issues, but he's also had a lot of times when he's put the car in the wall himself, or he's lost control of the car. And some would argue that maybe because he's driving at 10 tenths on the limit every time, and that might be true. But people don't remember that. They remember what the points you get every season, right? The stat book doesn't remember that you were driving really, really fast, because everyone's driving really, really fast, right? And so in my opinion, it's one thing to have that ability to drive on the knife's edge and to put the car in a place where maybe only you can take it. That might be a gift. But if you also don't learn from the fact that sometimes you shouldn't push a car over the edge, and that shows a lack in other attributes as a driver, right? And holistically, you don't just need speed to be a good F1 driver. Speed helps, but you need a lot of other things. And Carlos, I think, with his experience at other teams and just a little bit more time in F1, has a little bit of an edge on Charles in that aspect. He understands how to control a race. He understands when to push back with the team on strategy. And that's something that I see Charles kind of learning now. But in the first season, at least, it looked like Carlos was like, slapping around the race engineers and like, oh no, you're not doing this, I'm doing that. And like, it looked like he was the one that was running that team as a first driver, even if that wasn't necessarily the case. And so, but we've talked a little bit about the drivers. I think, Shez, you wanted to also talk about like fan bases and the criticisms. And we can segue into Mercedes too, because I'm a George Russell fan, self-admitted, and I always go on my pedestal and monologue about it in every Twitter space that you've mentioned I'm on. But there's a reason why I'm a fan of his, and we'll go about that. But the thing is, I think we need to understand that there's like it seems like there's a little bit of a like parasocial dynamics at play, right? Where social media has made us more connected than ever, and some people really feel connected. Um, and some would argue that maybe the Sainz fan base isn't as big, and I view that a little bit as like maybe timing and circumstance, right? Um, and so Charles came out, came into F1 when F1 was sort of beginning this new blossom of like riding the social media wave. You had Drive to Survive coming out, right? So these guys were debuting at a time when more of a vast age group of people were watching. And so that's why I think a lot of the younger fans like Charles, like Lando, like George, like all the new guys that are coming into the sport now, and then you have the veterans that are in the sport that kind of keep the past, like the decades old experience that they have. And then you have the drivers that kind of debuted in the middle and they're
Hmm.
sort of there, like Carlos, right? Where he's a great driver. And I would argue, aside from Max, right now, as of today, in this point of the season, after where we're at, he is the second best driver in form. I don't think anyone can argue that. Form is always dynamic though, and
This is
that's what I
it.
think people don't
Yeah, yeah,
understand.
this is
Form
it.
can come and go. And so a driver is rated both on their experience, their achievements, but
Hmm.
also on their current form. And so that's why I think right now he's the hottest driver in my opinion after Max Verstappen as far as like who would a team want to drive their car. Why is that though? Is he driving like this because he doesn't have a seat? Was that activated because he knows that he needs to drive and get a drive somewhere? Are the contracts a play? 1 year versus 8 years, does that breed more complacency in a driver if they know that, hey, I'm here forever, they're
Yeah.
gonna have to pay me to get rid of me. I'm gonna do it a lot of these things have a factor and a variable in each driver. Everyone's a little bit different. But right now, and that could change in the next race. But right now, Carlos is a top three driver on the grid based
Yeah,
off of how he's been performing,
yeah, and
right?
yeah, I do, I 100% agree with that. But as you very eloquently said, form is temporary, class is permanent, right? And that's kind of what this boils down to. I've never thought that Carlos is not a good driver, uh, but and I'm talking about those fan bases, right? So there's a sense that the Leclerc fans, and it's very much a Leclerc fan thing, feel like they have to make excuses for every qualifying defeat, every race defeat, everything. There's Carlos does something good, and it's a spurge on their drivers. They that Charles is casting aspersions on their driver. That's what I have trouble with, because you don't need to do that. Yes, Carlos is probably the second best driver on the grid right now. But if you look back at their record, and the record has to be looked at when you're assessing both drivers, it's never a snapshot of three races only.
Yep.
You know, in qualifying, Charles has absolutely demolished Carlos over the last three seasons. And in the races too, actually, if you look, oh my, there's not even any particular, like, it's not even close. We looked at the numbers for this, right?
Yeah,
And
we
in
did.
qualifying, it's not even close. But in the races, Carlos does come back. But even in that scenario, actually over the course of three seasons, he's not been able to overcome Charles. And that pattern you kind of expect to see repeated over the course of the whole season, which is why I don't think you can judge Carlos based on three races. You have to look at what he does over the course of the entire season. And to your point, Diplo, about you know why is he doing this right now? I think Carlos is absolutely loving the fact that people are talking up his performances. It's exactly what he needs right now.
Nothing to
He,
lose.
he's the guy who's out on his ear at the end of this season, right? He needs a place to land, and you can argue that this is either coincidence that he's suddenly driving brilliantly at the time that he really needs to, or maybe this is what he should have been doing the whole time anyway. Um, but maybe
Yeah, so
circumstances sort of helping him out a little bit. Go on.
Shez, I want to push back on your point about Leclerc having Carlos's number, right? And I think there's a little bit of a theory behind it. Charles has always been with Ferrari. Sainz came into Ferrari, and I think there was a little bit of an advantage that Leclerc has. And my argument is, I think you're starting to see that even out now because what is it? It's his third year, correct? This would be his third year with Ferrari. Is it the third or the fourth year? Right. So we started to see that tipping point
How
last
many
year. I
seasons
mean,
do you need, man?
Singapore. I know, but we started to see that last year. Well, I mean, look, listen, they were trying to help Leclerc win in 22, even though they couldn't really do that. But my point is, you are starting to see that. Why is it so late? I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, and maybe this is a characteristic of Sainz, and maybe it is a flaw of him, right? But I actually think that you're now starting to hit that sweet spot where he gets it. You can see, you can tell, you can read body language, you can hear comments and see that Carlos is more in sync with the car and with the team and with his engineers and even with Freddie Vasseur. So I don't know how those conversations go as the year passes. But I do want to take a step back, right? Going back to this whole idea of fan criticism and reaction, right? Let's go back to the end of January when we heard Lando sign his extension and then subsequently Charles signed his extension, right? We have never taken the moment to question whether Charles was the guy that Ferrari should have kept. If in fact they were courting Lewis Hamilton all along, which now we know they were. This goes back to the holidays, right? So this would have happened even as they were communicating with Charles and trying to get him an extension, right? And my question is, and I don't know the answer to this, my question is, had Leclerc not been a Ferrari guy from the beginning, do you think he would have gotten a new contract? Do you think that would have happened? Because we also heard rumors about him talking to Mercedes at that time. In hindsight, it all seems to have worked out well for him. But I mean, those are the dynamics that I think we sort of had to breeze past because Lewis Hamilton made this gigantic decision and announcement.
Let me take that one very quickly, right? And Diplo definitely chime in. But my take on this is like you've got two drivers at Ferrari, and the seven-time champion is suddenly available. Ferrari, unfortunately, are going to have to say, yeah, he's available. We're going to have to take him because that's
Sure.
it's
Yeah.
just a no-brainer. So then
Right.
you're left with, okay, well, one of these two drivers has to move aside. Now, who's it going to be? Is it going to be Charles or is it going to be Carlos? And let's take the Ferrari thing out of it for a second. And again, just go back to how they've performed over the course of the last 3 seasons coming into 2024. Charles has been the quicker driver in qualifying. He's beaten Carlos 2 seasons out of 3. If you look back at Carlos's record further back than that as well, against every teammate that he's been up against, every teammate of note, he's come out second best on the qualifying front. And only beaten Lando over the course of a season, right? In terms of the
I mean,
head-to-head. So for me, that's a no-brainer. And it's really unfortunate for Carlos that he's been on the receiving end of that through no fault of his own, really, because he has performed brilliantly. But if you're going to choose speed over occasional brilliance and calling strategy from the car, you're going to choose speed every single time.
I mean, like I said, it was just a question. Yeah. So I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I think to answer your question is they chose Charles to pair alongside Lewis. They didn't let Charles go. And I also think that the Ferrari stuff does matter because they've invested in him for so long that it would also that's why I said Formula One is so dynamic, man, because you have to think about these decisions, right? And it would be such a bad look on their academy if they're like, well, yeah, we'll support you, but if there's ever a driver that's never been affiliated with us, but he has championships, bye, like it's like, so really they made the right move.
Yeah.
I think they have a few more years with Charles as well, and as far as age and seasons go, right? Like you have a lot more seasons in the cachet with him. It sucks because you're right. Carlos did nothing wrong to deserve this, but at the same time, in the business world, you understand that it was purely a business decision. That's why you can't get too upset about it. And I don't think he's that upset about it. I don't think he's being petty with the team or anything. He's just going out there driving, trying to maximize his results so he can land somewhere else at the end of the season or get the best opportunity. And that's what I see in Carlos, right? He's not like, oh, let me slow Charles down in the pit stop or, oh, give him my tires and then pit him again so I can get my tires back. Like he's not trying to play games like that. He's just like, all right, I understand it. I don't agree with it, but I'm gonna go out there and just gonna keep. And that's kind of been the Carlos Sainz story,
It's a
right?
very
Like he's
Carlos
always
thing, isn't it?
he's had
Well,
he's never been really kicked out, but he's always had to go from one team to another, and this is just another thing that he has to do. So
Because he's always
I
just up against the next big thing. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. No, I think next year will be interesting, right? Because all of these questions will come to a head. I mean, right now we're talking about it in the abstract, but next year, do you support your guy, your academy driver, or you support the seven-time champion? I mean, they're going to have to make some decisions next year, especially
Yeah,
if they have a chance of, I mean,
yeah.
if the year goes the way it does right now, right? That'll be interesting.
Okay, so this is a nice little segue into Mercedes. And if we're talking about driver academies, I mean George has been with Merck since he was a karter, right? So how do you feel about the discourse that goes on at Merck? Because it's volatile and the fan bases are they're just ready to stab everyone in the back.
So, I guess I'll take this one first. Look, uh, I like George ever since I started getting back into F1, which is around the Drive to Survive time. I mean, like I was always keeping in touch with it, but I'm not gonna lie to anybody and say like I was following it ever since the day I was born, every season, watching every races. That's not necessarily a truth. But when I started watching again, I read the backstory on what he was doing, and a lot of people, like I think tend to write George off, but like if you hype Leclerc up based off of also what he's done in the juniors, George literally mimicked it the year after, and some would argue in an even more competitive F2 grid, um, to
Yeah.
to add on to that. But then he got stuck at Williams, kind of like how the worst team gets the first draft pick. He kind of got stuck there. A team that couldn't afford to uh, pay to show up to preseason testing in his rookie year. So he's done a lot to sort of build his way up, but I cheered for him because he was sort of that underdog, right? Like he was given all of these crap circumstances and somehow still was able to make some magic happen, with the car. The car was always a one lap car, like most, like we know some cars are built to be race pace. Some cars are built quicker around a lap, and I think Haas had that issue a few years ago, and they still might. And so, that Williams was never great around a race. So whenever George could shine through, it was always through a qualifying performance. That's why he got the nickname and everything like that. But then you saw the magic, right? You saw it wasn't just like people hyping him up, right? Like when he sat in for Lewis in 2020 when Lewis had COVID, like that was an example of a guy who could drive a fast car fast, right? Because not every driver can take the best car and on their first real foray with it, their first weekend with it, it's not size to him. I mean, we see George and Lewis next to each other. They're considerably different in height. He had to wear boots that are smaller and learn the new steering wheel. And, like some of that is, yeah, you do it every now and then in the simulator, maybe when you do your Mercedes obligations, but other times, on a whim like that, it's also pretty accomplishing. And he was able to, through no fault of his own, obviously he got P9, but he was on course to win the race again, even after the
Yeah.
tire mishap, before like when they did the swap tires and he had to pit twice or three times on a 55-second lap circuit, like that's a lot of time to lose and still be able to, so he's pacey, he's racy, he can win. And the you go through the Williams stuff and then you get put next to the best driver in the sport, statistically speaking. That's a tough benchmark, and I think criticisms, there are valid criticisms for George that I think all young drivers that haven't really competed for a championship are they've earned, right, like the valid criticism. But when I look at the story, I don't cheer George on, and I think this is what you want to get to. I never cheer George on at the detriment of Lewis, but rather
Yeah.
because I know the benchmark that Lewis is. And a lot of people will say, well, yeah, well, if he's not winning a championship, he's not really giving it 110%. That may or may not be true, but he's going out there every weekend and racing a race car too, right? And so there has to be something said when, you know, Max is doing all this domination and all Sky Sports can talk about is the head-to-head between Lewis and George, like in qualifying. You know what I mean? Like Lewis still brings that focus for the media. And George, I think, is a driver that, I mean, like, if we look back to the ground effect era since George moved to the team, they've been the closest match pair as
Yeah.
far as pace
Yeah.
and qualifying goes, right?
Yeah.
They each have a season as far as finishing position on one another, but they've been the closest delta as far as qualifying weekend in, weekend out. And to me, I'm like, that's awesome because I don't like, I'm not here to shit on Lewis, but my driver is like so close to him and he is who he is. Lewis is that guy. Like that's what makes me happy. That's what I'm
Yeah.
like, oh my God, like he's on pace with Lewis and Lewis is Lewis, right? And so that's what I wish, some of the fans, like, it's not all the fans, but the most passionate ones that usually get 90% of the stage light, um, even though they're probably 10% of the fan base, right? They're usually so quick to like make an excuse or defend Lewis when he doesn't really need
Need it,
defending. And
exactly.
sometimes it reeks of insecurity in your driver because if your driver is that guy, he's not making excuses for himself. So why are we? Right?
Yeah. I
Sometimes
mean,
he just has a bad weekend because he's human, right? All humans, we're not infallible. We do have bad days, we do have bad weekends, and sometimes as much as it pains you, you have every right to feel how you feel. I'm not here to gatekeep anyone's emotions or reactions, but at the same time, you don't cheer for someone by punching down on someone else. Like that's never been a thing for me. Like it's never been right. It's never been okay because I don't do that, and your guy definitely doesn't need to do that because he's accomplished so much in the sport that
yeah.
there's no reason for that. But yeah, that's my little tangent. We can continue it.
No, no, I think you're right, but I think you find yourself in a minority of people that are happy in the same way that Sainz fans find themselves in a minority of fans that are talking up a drive that is already considered to not be as good, right? For some reason, on a superficial level, they've already been dismissed, and Leclerc fans are the same. They'll always have to make excuses for their driver because of that sort of insecurity. And I feel like George is his performances are held up as a way of derogating Lewis as opposed to actually being celebrated on their own merit. And I think that is probably what makes you annoyed about the dialogue
Mm.
about him too.
I would say that if when that happens, it's mostly coming from a media narrative
Hmm.
perspective, where
Yeah,
the
maybe.
Yeah.
pundits are like, "Well, look at Lewis is losing to George," and then what happens is then it trickles down into the social media sphere, and then the fan base is like, "Well, no, I have to defend myself or my driver against this like Crofty or Damon Hill. Someone said something about Lewis being, like, oh, he's not performing as well," and then the other fans, there are some crazy George Russell fans too, and they're like, "Well, no, because our driver actually is that good." Blah, and it does become a downward spiral. But I think when you look at the nuance, you have a guy who is really on Charles's level. I don't think he's as fast, but he's
It's
in
close
that
though, isn't it? It's
in
close.
he's in that well, around a lap. Again, I think Charles has had the benefit of being at a top team earlier in his career to kind of develop quicker, but in the same way, I also think that those Williams years are why George is doing a lot better with a bad car in the ground effect era for Mercedes because he sort of had to learn to like, hey man, here you go, make with it what you will, and maybe that's where Lewis has had a little bit of a tougher time because he's had such good cars that didn't need to be like, oh, where do and it's not that he can't do it, it's just that he hasn't had to do it in a while, right? I don't Does that make sense? And
Yeah.
so maybe
He's
he
got
came in there
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
he's like, oh, well, but the fans will be like, oh, he's experimenting, that's why he didn't beat George. Well, he's experimenting not because the team's making him, it's because he wants to find some level of confidence and
Yeah.
comfort in the car. It's
Yeah.
not like Toto Wolff is like, hey Lewis, thanks for driving for us, and before you go out there, remember you got to run these experiments for no, he's just changing the setups himself as much as he can within the tolerances that are preset to try to see if he can extract more or push the car more on the limit. And that's a Lewis thing. Maybe the
Yeah.
team benefits from that, but
Yeah.
it's not like the team is like Sir Lewis, your job is to develop this car and run experiments while George gets to just
Yeah,
get consistent points. It's not the case.
yeah. That
But
is.
again, it becomes an excuse. And we've seen that for all of 2022 when
Hmm.
George beat Lewis, when he was just way more consistent, at least at the beginning half of the season. Oh, it's experiments. It's, you know, and it sucks because Lewis doesn't really need excuses. He's just having a bad season. He's having a hard time adapting to the ground effect era, and that's okay. Every driver has that. Like, they're entitled to have a bad season. They're entitled to have a bad regulation era. The problem is with Lewis is that he also is not the Lewis of 10 years ago. He has a handful of years left in the sport. So the anxiety of like, well, will Lewis be able to challenge for a driver's chance?
Yeah.
It all builds up, like it's, I feel like it's a little bit of everything. I understand it,
I hear
but
you.
I also, I don't like when it gets too personal. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
when they're making personal attacks on people and the fan base. That's just but those folks weed themselves out. I think it's quite easy to see and mute and block them. But for the most part, it's crazy. I'm excited to see what happens at Ferrari because those two fan bases, like the fringes of both, man,
Oh, it's gonna be
we
I
might we
don't. I
might
hate
need we
it.
might need to have some popcorn on hand because look, it could go
and some
completely
Valium.
fine, but it has the ability to be like you might
Yeah.
open Twitter and your phone just starts smoking every time you open Twitter.
But which I think is going to be completely opposed to the two drivers themselves, who I think will get on and work together
I think they're friendly.
just
I
fine.
think
Yeah, I think that'll.
Lewis likes. I think they both like each other, and I mean, you see that when they interact off the camera and outside of the PR stuff.
Yeah.
Like, like George was like third wheel when Lewis was taking a picture of Charles. Like, hey, let me stop and take a picture of you at this sign, and George was just like, okay, like I'm your teammate. Like
Yeah.
I think they have a better relationship than Lewis and George ever did, and
Um,
I'm not gonna lie about
yeah,
that. Other than what you have to interact with as teammates. But as a driver, I think Lewis might like Charles more, and that's fine.
yeah.
Maybe they
Well,
do get along.
I guess we'll find out. Amar, comment on this a little bit. What do you think about the
Yeah,
discourse
well,
here?
as a Ferrari fan, I always say these four words while watching a race. Don't mess it up. And I think I'm going to be saying that particular phrase every race next year because I do believe that Ferrari will I don't know if they can really challenge Red Bull this year, but next year I think it's looking really, really good. But to have this dynamic, which is what worries me, is, why are we doing this right now? Like we could have pulled off another year, but that's neither here nor there. Like that's what I don't want to see happen. I think the other thing with these driver comparison is, right, I think winning cures a lot of things, right? So if your team is winning, the volume generally turns down on driver criticisms and comparisons a little bit more. I mean, I don't think Red Bull fans are really arguing anything right now other than arguing with the rest of us, right? Or fighting with the rest of us.
Just sprinkling it in there.
Yeah, but at this point, none of us can say anything. We just got to keep quiet and just applaud it for what the dominance is, right? But we've seen the two teams struggle, right? And particularly Mercedes now is it's interesting. It is clearly at the end of its dynastic run. Not that it couldn't start another one, but this dynasty has ended, and it kind of ended with a thud, right? And in Abu Dhabi 21, and then I think like everything else has since been sort of a symbolic way of seeing all of this fade out. And I think Lewis gets wrapped into that too, because it is word association with that success, with everything that they've stood for the last decade plus. They have been the gold standard by far. I would imagine that if someday Max's run and Red Bull's run comes to an end, that I could see him leaving, in part because why would you want to stay in this sport having experienced that high to now be struggling to get into Q3, right? Why would you want to do that, right? And I think that Mercedes find themselves in that area. And therefore, I mean, I cannot blame Lewis for feeling less than motivated. I mean, look, if you've been fighting for race
Yeah.
wins, is this something that really motivates you? And I know that at Suzuka they tried to work together as a team, but I just hated kind of seeing that happen because I've always experienced Lewis Hamilton being the me first kind of guy, right? And that's sort of what you come to appreciate of him. So I get that he did all the right things in playing a great team sport, and they tried everything they could, but I just don't see it happening anymore. So I think it'll be interesting to see if he can revive himself at Ferrari because I think if that run goes poorly, right? And I don't think it'll go poorly. I mean, given what these last couple of years have been, and it's probably going to be better than that. But if he cannot regain that sort of championship form, which, as we all have agreed to, form comes and goes, it's not necessarily true that he would just find that form magically at Ferrari. So I think it'd be interesting.
I know we have just
Yeah,
a few
no,
minutes left, but
yeah, go
I
for it, go for
will
it.
say one thing. I think a win right now for Ferrari in the next few years with Lewis and Charles is a constructor championship. And how do
Yep.
you do that, right? I don't think Ferrari, if they get a driver's championship, so be it. If Lewis gets his eighth, amazing, right? What a history, what a way to write history, what a way to end the book, right? If he wins his eighth with a Ferrari or whatever. But I do think that the next big win for Ferrari is to try to get that constructor championship, because that would mean so much to the team and to the fan base, a lot more than a driver's championship would. Sometimes it comes with the territory. But
Yeah.
why I say this is this: at Red Bull, the Achilles heel is Checo, and not because he's a bad driver, but because he can't match Max. We've seen that gap where last year, if Checo didn't participate in any race weekend, Max still would have won the constructor championship for Red Bull. And what do you need to beat that? You need two guys that are alpha drivers that I was hoping would have happened with Mercedes, but Mercedes didn't build a great car for Lewis and George. But you need two guys that can challenge and not take points off of each other. Maybe they'll do that as a byproduct, but take points opportunities away from Max.
Yeah.
If they can both hold that fire to Max, I don't think Max is that great under pressure, because he's only had one real season where he's had to deal with that. And we've seen toward the end of that how that went, where he walked off the podium because he lost the race over there and he had a lot of attitude and behavioral things. I don't think he does well under pressure, especially if it's around two drivers. And I think if that happens, Ferrari can definitely get the constructor championship. And I think that that's what they're going to gun for in the short term. And if that's the case, then the driver dynamic doesn't really matter. Even if they take points off of each other, as long as they're maximizing points away from Max, that's it. That's the recipe. So they just need to get the car. If they get the car, then everything else will happen.
Amar, there's your answer, right? Two alphas.
Yeah.
That's the answer to the debate we had
There
a
you
few
go.
weeks ago.
Well, and look, Lewis knows how to fight for championships and how to take a championship
Yeah.
fight across a whole season.
Yes, he
Leclerc
does.
doesn't, but he has the speed. Carlos doesn't have Leclerc's speed, and he doesn't have that championship challenging experience. So maybe now we've answered that question as to why they chose Lewis.
So I just want to push back a little bit there on the Lewis has lost motivation, or Lewis has had it kind of thing. And I know, so this is exactly what the fan bases are guilty of, and we're doing it right here because this is how easy it is to fall into that trap of, you're talking up one driver, it's automatically talking down the other driver. I don't see it as a Lewis losing motivation necessarily. And I did at one point, right? We talked about this in our Fernando and Lewis are getting too old video, that perhaps Fernando still feels like he's got something to prove, whereas Lewis is like, well, I'm just in it for a world championship, and if this car isn't going to do it for me, what's the point of me pushing? And I think I reached a eureka moment when I watched the Australian Grand Prix. Even though Lewis was beaten in qualifying by George, it was the manner in which he was beaten that kind of made that point for me, that Lewis was actually ahead through most of the final sector. There was only that last little bit at the final corner where he made a mistake that lost him that edge. It was less than a tenth, wasn't it, that dropped him out of that meant he couldn't progress into quali 3, but George did, and that made a big difference in terms of their qualifying positions and their perception of that particular qualifying session. But the margins were small, and for me, what that told me was that Lewis is still pushing. He's still trying to find something in that car. He said this himself, that it's not just about getting the most out of this car. That's not what it is. He's trying to find that. We always talk about symbiosis, and we've talked about it a lot on this. I think I talk about it on nearly every video now. But he's trying to find that with this car. And the experiments aren't like, I'm experimenting because the team are asking me to do it. I agree with you, Diplo. He's doing it because he is trying to find something with that car that he is missing. Yeah. And the fact that he keeps trying to do that suggests to me that he hasn't lost motivation, that he's still trying to find something, even in his final season of a team that he's going to leave. He's been there it'll be 9 years, 10 years by the time he leaves. and goes to Ferrari. He's still trying to find that special something that he doesn't have yet. And to me, it crystallized the dichotomy between these two drivers, between George and Lewis, right? And I really, really don't want anyone to take this the wrong way, because I'm not trying to
Uh-oh.
mean it
Oh
disparagingly to
no.
anybody.
Oh no.
But what you said about Diplo, what you said about George being used to driving a car that isn't quite there at Williams is what he's showing now at Mercedes, that he's able to absolutely maximize what a recalcitrant car can do, right? And this is a talent that we see someone like Fernando has as well, and we all talk up how amazing Fernando is, that he can take a dog and make it shine, right? And that's what George is starting to show now. And over the course of the last 3 seasons, he's putting that car in places that it shouldn't really be, because he's able to absolutely maximize. I'm not going to say that he's getting results out of it that it can't get, because physics doesn't allow that, but he's getting the absolute most out of it. Whereas Lewis, I feel, is just not happy with that level. Like perhaps he could get that level, and in races like Japan just now, and the latter half of 2022, you could see that he just sort of accepted it. It was like, all right, fine, this is just what the car can do. This is what I'm going to do. But in the sessions where he's not able to do that, there seems to be a sense that I'm fighting to get more out of this car, because I think there's more out of it. There must be a better level for me to be able to win races and championships, and that's what I'm aiming for.
Mm.
And there's a subtle difference there between the two. Neither is. Go on, Diplo. You've got your finger up.
The only thing that
Punch
I was
something
gonna
into the
say,
screen. Yeah.
yes, yeah, no, I'm not mad at what you're saying. It's 100% true. But I would argue, and I think you like the tweet that kind of alluded to what I'm about to say earlier, I think in the week. The only difference between when people talk about Fernando, Max, and Lewis are not at the, or Charles, Lando, and George are not at that level. Yeah, because they've never had the opportunity to challenge for a
Thank
championship
you.
yet. So
Thank
we
you.
don't know
Thank you.
how they will act and or react.
Yes.
So George, at this point, all he can do is try to squeeze the most out of a car, because he
100%.
doesn't know what it's like to
100%.
have a championship winning car. Lewis has had multiple, so he's like, this is not up to the standard of winning a championship. I'm going to try to find how I can
A
make
little
it
bit
there.
more. Yeah.
And that's the nuance that doesn't get taken into consideration. It's not that they're different. I mean, I'm sure that they're different people. They have different driving styles. They have different personalities. Everybody is unique in that sense. But the one thing that one driver definitely does not have, and the other one definitely does have, is championship challenging experience and championship winning experience. And so you can't begrudge George for acting the way he does, because every driver at George's age and level that doesn't have a championship winning car needs to act like that, or they're not supposed to be in F1. That's what I don't understand, because most people are like, he's so competitive, elbows out, willing to push his teammate. It's like, yeah, show me a driver that doesn't do that, and I'll show you a guy who fizzles out in 2 seasons because they're not supposed to be in the sport.
Yeah.
Right. When he's gone wheel to wheel with Max, I think he's the only driver, and this is a hot take, out of the young guys that would actually rather crash with Max than to like seed. I don't know why I say that, but every time that they've fought together on the track, I've always seen Lando kind of pick his battle, and that's maybe a smart thing in the long term. But I've always seen when Lewis or when George and Max always end up together somehow, they're either pushing each other off the track, they're banging wheels, they're banging side pods in Baku, or like, and so he has that. He just hasn't had the car to really show what he can actually do, right? And Lewis has, and he needs to get back there. That's the
difference.
You either have it or you don't, and Lewis has that, right? Very few drivers have that. Some drivers win one and they're like, all right, cool, I've done it, I'm gonna go retire, aka Nico Rosberg. And he was a good driver too, but do you have that willingness to keep coming in year after year and say, okay, even if this car sucks, I want to find the answers? Some drivers have it, some drivers don't. Not all drivers that win championships have that, but the ones that do are the ones that are still here.
So maybe we need Max and George to find a seat together, right? So maybe the Max to Mercedes rumors can still stay on for now until an announcement becomes imminent.
Look, and a lot of people have said that Max would mop the floor with George, and I don't think
yeah, I
that
don't think
would
so
be the
either.
case.
I
I think Max is a very gifted driver. He's very fast and very consistent. Nobody takes that away from him. But he also hasn't really had a teammate to challenge him, to keep him honest. And that's no disrespect to Checo, because your ceiling is what your ceiling is, and if you can't match, you can't match, and that's okay. Checo is a plenty fast driver, but he's not fast as Max. But I do think that there are drivers that are closer to Max in natural pace, and if they have the same machinery, that they would give him a little bit of a harder time. And like, Max is not going to go anytime soon. Max doesn't want Checo to leave. Max doesn't want to leave Red Bull, because why would you leave something that's just on autopilot right now? And that's not to say he's not putting in the effort. He is, right? I mean, but why would you want to mess that up right now? Maybe if Red Bull starts like losing performance, or other teams start catching up, you're like, okay, well, where's the next, but yeah, it'll be interesting. Look, we have a young crop of drivers between, Max is young, but he's been in F1 for a while. So age-wise, I mean, in experience. But, we have these young drivers that are going to carry the sport for the next 15 years, and other drivers that will come and go. And I think it's something beautiful. I have to end on like, my tangent has to be a little bit diplomatic where everyone can agree. I really think that, like, you take the passion aside, you have the sport is in good hands. These guys are really fast, they're really competitive, and they know what they're doing. But also, if Lewis doesn't win his 8th, it's not the end of the world. And I will say to people, this is a message to anyone who cares to listen to me. Enjoy the time that your driver still has pushing around a car, even if it's not going for P1, because at some point he will retire that helmet and you won't get to see him race anymore. And you'll just have to think about all the times where he was magic. Enjoy the magic he's making now by just virtue of driving that car, even if he's not winning, because at some point it won't be happening anymore. And you'll look back on it and you'll be like, damn, I spent so much fighting with people on Twitter than rather enjoying my driver while he's still racing. I don't know. That's just my 2 cents.
Indeed. And on that bombshell, I think we should call it a day.
Cool.
Diplo, mate, that was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
That was great. That was really great. It literally felt like a Twitter space. It was really good fun. Amar, thanks, man. It's been awesome as always. Thank you for leaving the kid with the babysitter.
There we go.
As always, please, guys, like, subscribe, comment. We read all of the comments. We even replied to some of them. We'll see you in the next one.